Hello viewers and welcome to another card evaluation video in the Lord of the Rings The Card Game Progression series. My name is Mitch.
And I'm Matthew.
And today let's take a look at the player cards introduced in the third adventure pack in the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle, A Journey to Rhosgobel. So Matthew, please start us off by introducing us to our latest hero.
In this adventure pack, we get a leadership hero, Prince Imrahil. He has 11 threat cost, 2 willpower, 3 attack, and 2 defense strength, and 4 hit points. Prince Imrahil is Gondor and noble, and his response reads, after a character leaves, play Ready Prince Imrahil, limit once per round. Certainly I like his stats. I mean, nice and beefy, sort of akin to Aragorn, although he has a smaller hit point pool, also doesn't have Sentinel. I like the ability. I will say the first thing that comes into mind reviewing him now, as opposed to when we did in the first progression series, is that Horn of Gondor, as you've so often mentioned, Mitch, has been nerfed. And Horn of Gondor was a great combo with this guy. In addition to, you had the ally leaving play, you got to toot the horn, and then you got to ready Prince Imrahil. Now, he can still ready regardless of how a character leaves play, whether it's sneak attack, whether it's being destroyed, or whether it's through some other shenanigans. It's just the horn, which was such a great combo with this character, doesn't work quite as well. He's not a hero that I have really ever seen on the table very much. Even back then, in the sort of the middle of the game's life, and even today, I did try building a deck, a couple years ago, that was my allies leave play deck, and he was a hero in it, and sort of trying to play on that theme before Sylvan were a theme, and that's what they do, is have allies pop in and out. The deck never really worked all that well. I like on the one hand that it's limited to once per round because it could probably get abused if it was more often. On the flip side, he'd be a much better hero if he could do it, 2 or 3 times around, where you could do some fun tricks during action windows and stages, in certain phases. With that said, I think he's a decent general purpose hero, meaning his stat line. He can quest fairly well, he attacks fairly well, he can defend in a pinch, and so if you are getting that action advantage, let's say he defends something and you defend another attack, or someone else does and a character dies, he can ready, and with his beefy 3 attack, he can swing back. So I think I've said a lot of disparate thoughts here. I think he's an okay hero. I wouldn't call him a great hero.
Well, just like Aragorn, after whom he's so closely modeled, he can do an awful lot, albeit at a slightly smaller threat cost, and he doesn't offer quite so much versatility. Just like you said, he's great at attacking, defending, questing, whatever it is that you want him to do, but he doesn't have Sentinel to defend for other players, and instead of investing resources into him to guarantee that he's going to be ready, you either have to build your deck anticipating that you're going to have things leaving play to ready Imrahil, or otherwise you're just going to have to chance not being able to ready the fellow. If you don't have an ally to serve as a chump blocker, maybe Imrahil, who previously quested, isn't going to be able to ready to attack or defend himself. And certainly if you're in a multiplayer game, there are going to be more and more opportunities for him to trigger, but I think unlike Aragorn, he definitely requires a bit more attention to successfully use. But if during the normal ebb and flow of a game you can expect characters to be leaving play, in, say, 5 or 6 rounds, you might save 5 or 6 resources just because you can kind of ready him for free, as opposed to, investing his resource each and every quest phase into ensuring that he's going to be ready. I also think it's cool that, unlike Aragorn, you can't just commit him to the quest and then have him defend or attack, but you could potentially have him defend twice, or you could have him attack twice. He doesn't have access to the range of signature-style attachments that Aragorn sees, things like Calabrian Stone, and we'll see many other cards that benefit Aragorn specifically. Imrahil doesn't have that advantage, but he's still plenty versatile. His threat cost is, I think, high enough that you're not likely to be running Aragorn and Imrahil, and certainly you can, and just reap a ridiculous amount of action advantage. But if you've got Westfold Horsebreaker in your deck, you can discard that ally to ready a hero, and you ready Imrahil. You mentioned sneak attack, so maybe your ally bounces back to your hand, and that readies Imrahil. He's got the Gondor trait, something that Aragorn does not, so it's possible he could do a double defense for 3 or a double attack for 4. And we even previously covered Borne Aloft, which is another on-demand means of readying the prince, and if you've got characters leaving play, you may as well run him along with Valiant Sacrifice. So just like you pointed out, I don't have a ton of experience using Imrahil. I certainly remember a time in the original Progression series where having you and I run a large number of action advantage heroes works out spectacularly, but he offers up some very interesting options for players, and even though he seems deceptively similar to Aragorn, he is pretty different, and as we see more and more allies that either leave play at the end of the phase, or cards that allow you to return things to hand, allies that have effects upon entering play, so you're further incentivized to have them return to hand, Imrahil just opens up a whole host of cool possibilities, and even though I may not be too likely to play him, I am quite the fan of our new hero here. So do let Matthew and I know your personal sentiments and experience in the comments when it comes to including Prince Imrahil in decks. But Matthew, anything else to say before we move on past our new hero?
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of great points there. And as you were speaking, what sort of came to my mind is I think in many ways, Prince Imrahil is a better multiplayer hero than he is a solo or maybe even two-player hero. In that with 3 or 4 players at the table, which is predominantly how I play very few, I never play solo, and I rarely play two-player. But if you're playing with someone and you know they're going to be using Sylvan, this is a great character to put in your deck because they're going to be popping in and out. It's difficult to get him to work if you were designing your own deck to be dependent on losing allies, particularly now that Horn of Gondor is nerfed. But if in a 4-player game, someone's going to be chump blocking, and allies, hopefully not heroes, are dying at least every turn or popping in due to sneak attack or something else. So definitely if you kind of need a third hero in a 4-player game, and you don't know who to pick and you want leadership, I think he's a good option.
Yeah, and I'll just say if chump blocking is going to be your strategy of choice, then if you don't have any enemies engaged with you, I suppose it's generally safe to send him to the quest. It doesn't cost you anything to do so, and if you're holding back a Snowborn Scout or something like that, if it just so happens you defend an attack, your scout dies, he readies, then that's great, and you don't have to keep pumping tokens into him as you do Aragorn. But what else is in store for the leadership sphere?
Well, first up is the newest signal attachment, Dunedain Quest. It costs 2, and it must attach to a hero, and the attached hero gets +1 willpower strength. And just like the other signals in this cycle, it has an action. You can pay 1 resource from the attached hero's pool to attach Dunedain Quest to another hero. What's interesting to me is compared to the other signals that we've gotten so far, this one's more expensive. All the other ones cost 1 to get +1 defense or +1 attack strength. This one is 2 resources for 1 willpower strength. So this, it seems to me, the designers of the game early on were much less willing to give big willpower boosts than they were attacking and defending, although Faramir certainly didn't stop them from giving big willpower boosts, but in every other sense, it tends to be a bit more expensive. With that said, I very rarely ever use this card. I'm not sure I ever have. I certainly don't see it played in a lot of decks. I think what it has going for it is it's not Spirit. Right, and so Spirit has some other ways that it can raise willpower, Favor of the Lady, for example. We do have Celebrian Stone that can be helpful, it's better on Aragorn than it is on other characters, and this is a bit more universal. And it can be passed around if you decide, there's some quests, for example, where certain players can't quest unless, X condition is met, unless you have a certain objective, or unless you're the first player, or whatever it is. And so in that sense, this could be nice to pass over from the non-questing team to the heroes that can actually quest. Signals have seen a bit of a resurgence in the past couple of months, where there are now allies and cards and so forth that deal with signals, but I'm still not quite convinced that this is the one you're going to want to go hunting for.
It just strikes me as so expensive for what it does. It's basically an objectively better leadership version of the Favor of the Lady, but it costs 2, and even at this point in the card pool, we've started to see some 2-cost, 1 willpower allies. And considering that leadership has effects like Faramir and For Gondor that give you a bigger benefit the more allies you have in play, if you're already running effects like that, why not just fill your deck with more quest-capable allies as opposed to attachments like this one? For the cost of 2, you mentioned Faramir earlier, he could give you a much greater benefit for the cost of 2 additional resources. I don't have a lot of experience transferring Dunedain Warning and Dunedain Mark that give defense and attack bonuses respectively, and I certainly can't really see myself transferring control of Dunedain Quest from one character to another. Probably the strangest thing about this is this pack introduced Prince Imrahil, and earlier we've seen Aragorn, and leadership has a significant number of character-readying effects. And until we see many more scenarios, there just aren't a lot of occasions when you're going to need a large amount of willpower multiple times. So I could see having a character with really high defense, defending multiple times. The same thing goes for attacking. But Dunedain Quest is just expensive, and it seems more limited in its utility. Eventually, we do start to see quests that have you conduct tests where you need to use willpower multiple times during the same game round, but I frankly would just much rather pop another cheap ally in my deck, so of all the signals thus far, I can't really see myself running this one anytime soon.
Yeah, I think in the early life of the game, leadership is very much hampered by Steward of Gondor, and we could maybe even argue that continues to this day. But what I mean specifically is a lot of leadership cards to me early on seem to be overcosted for what they deliver, which makes me then speculate, are they overcosted compared to the other spheres because of the existence of Steward of Gondor? If Steward of Gondor didn't exist, would this still be 2? Would it maybe have been 1 and the other marks are free? There's no way to know. We don't live in an alternate universe. But it is interesting that they chose to make this one more expensive. And I kind of wish I knew the exact design thought process behind it. But perhaps because questing is pretty much universal in every adventure that we ever get to play, whereas attacking or defending aren't always as critical, that's why they made it a bit more expensive. With that said, leadership often with Steward of Gondor has a glut of resources, and there are worse things that you could play for 2 resources, other than a permanent willpower boost that's, always going to be appreciated, if not necessary. So would I maybe put 1 or 2 in a deck? Yeah, but rarely would it be a 3 of. But we might change our mind when we get some cool willpower effects much later on in the game's life. But in a general sense, with a big, broad overview of the game's life and history, not a card that you'll probably see in my leadership decks anytime soon.
Yeah, I do think you brought up a great point with its expense isn't so steep that it's out of the question to put it in play, and certainly in a core set plus Shadows of Mirkwood style environment, questing is where decks tend to flounder. I just think it's that leadership has next to no in-sphere card draw, and as I'm so fond of saying, if I draw this hoping to, stumble upon something to get me out of a jam, it's just going to be a little bit of a heartbreaker compared to some much more powerful card. But what's our second leadership card?
It is the 0-cost event, Parting Gifts. Action. Move any number of resource tokens from a leadership hero's resource pool to any other hero's resource pool. Well, I'm not a huge fan of the art on this particular card. I will say that it's an interesting effect. I just mentioned on our previous card about the glut of resources that the player with Steward of Gondor often has. We experienced that in my last playthrough when I was drawing nothing but leadership, but I had Steward of Gondor on Legolas and tactics and wasn't drawing any tactics, and you were very envious of my pile of resources.
Right.
Now, this card wouldn't have helped me with that because you have to move it from a leadership hero's resource pool, although, of course, Song of Kings might help with that. But it's a way to sort of share the wealth because Steward of Gondor is unique. Only one player can have it, and whoever doesn't have it is probably envious of it. So it's a way to sort of lessen the hate amongst the team here, the Fellowship. So I appreciate it from that perspective. But honestly, I'd rather share resources with something like Theodred or some of the cards we're going to get a little bit later on in future cycles. I've not seen this one used very much. And again, as you so often say, do you really want to top deck this card? It's a nice knit situation if you want to be a good team player, but even in solo play, I suppose it has some uses. But yeah, this is just one I don't use, even though I recognize the potential benefit of it.
Yeah, this is a pretty interesting card. It's definitely utility focused, and it could be a bit of an emergency card or a bit of a combo enabler, and it can help one player fund some of their most expensive effects. But I'm not sure that it's necessary at this point in the card pool. Generally, when I build a deck, it's like 2 heroes from one sphere and 1 hero from another. So maybe if you're running 2 leadership heroes, or your minor sphere hero is leadership, but it's someone like Theodred that could generate a lot of resources, maybe your other heroes aren't being committed to the quest, you can kind of smooth out your distribution of resources, and you can certainly help another player. Often, when I sit down to build decks for the 2 of us, I don't include stuff like Bjorn in the tactics deck, just because he's so prohibitively and impossibly expensive. But if we can kind of together channel our resources into one hero, and then you can fund expensive card effects like Bjorn or a pair of Citadel plates or whatever, then it becomes much more realistic to get those cards into play. But I think in a perfect world, you will maybe use effects like Theodred that can be used repeatedly. Like Parting Gifts is free resource-wise, but it's still a card coming off the top of your deck. It eats one of your draws, whether that's naturally occurring or it's from Barivore or from Gleowine. So I just really would rather have something that I can always rely on sitting out on the tabletop, as opposed to hoping that I top deck a Parting Gifts during my hour of most desperate need. I think it's cool that in emergencies you can potentially shift resources from one hero to another, like let's say I've got a hill troll or some nasty spider, something like that engaged with me, and I've got a forest snare in hand, but I've only got 1 lore hero. Maybe Matthew could toss me a couple of resources, I can pay for that forest snare, or let's say in between staging and quest resolution, we reveal some unexpected locations. I've got secret paths in my hand, but I don't have a resource or 2 to play a copy or 2. Again, maybe my other player can assist me with that. But it's an action, it's not a response, so you have to play it during those action windows. And just as our card pool gets broader and broader, we start to see more other, more reliable card effects that kind of have this same built-in function. So maybe if you're running Glowin with healing, it's likely that you're going to end up with just a huge stockpile of resources all focused on one character. Maybe if you've got Steward of Gondor that's really outpacing, its resource generation is really outpacing how quickly you're drawing cards. Horn of Gondor isn't nearly as effective as it used to be, so I just think it's less likely that players are going to have a ridiculous ridiculous number of gifts accumulated, and I suppose I've always been pretty selfish with my presence, and this card just isn't strong enough to really compel me to put it in a deck.
That brings us to our tactics cards, and up first is the ally Landroval. Landroval costs a whopping 5 resources. Maybe we do need some parting gifts. And he has 1 willpower, 3 attack, and 1 defense strength, and 4 hit points. Landroval is a creature and an eagle. Landroval is also sentinel, but he cannot have restricted attachments. Response. After a hero card is destroyed, return Landroval to his owner's hand to put that hero back into play with 1 damage token on it. Limit once per game. Also worth noting that Landroval is a unique ally. Man, is this ally expensive, but super cool. Eagles definitely have a soft spot in my heart. I wish they were more fleshed out as a trait. They've been around since the beginning and are probably one of the most undeveloped traits of the game, sadly. But this is a cool answer to heroes dying, and we probably could have used this on a few of our quest playthroughs. There is the spirit event, Fortune or Fate, that brings back dead heroes. This is kind of a more fun way to do it because you can be using Landroval's stats and those sorts of things up until that point. But Landroval is quite pricey, so it's probably going to be an ally that sits in your hand for quite a while. I can't seem to manage to pay for Beorn in my decks. Landroval slightly cheaper, but also going to be equally difficult to pay for. So I do think it's really cool art, a really cool effect. I think it's very awesome and thematic, but often tough to get this ally into play if you're only running 1 or 2 tactics heroes.
It is a very interesting card. It is far more proactive than Fortune or Fate, and really my biggest problem with Fortune or Fate isn't even that it's just sitting in your hand doing nothing, because as you mentioned, Landroval could be attacking for 3, he could be defending because he's got the Sentinel keyword, and he could even be questing, but Fortune or Fate costs 5 resources, Landroval costs 5 resources. The big difference here is when one of your spirit heroes dies, you lose all the resources it had, you lose all the attachments it had. Maybe you used all of the resources from one of your heroes to put Landroval into play, and that way you're paying for the resurrection cost in advance, as opposed to finding yourself like, oh crap, my hero's dead, and all the resources I could have used to bring my hero back to life are now gone with that hero. There's not too much benefit yet from Landroval being a creature, but each and every new eagle makes conflict at the Carrack a little bit easier because a frightened beast, that treachery card that raises each player's threat by an amount equal to the number of threat strength sitting in the staging area, unless you discard a creature, that just gets a little bit easier to manage every time. I really like that Landroval, even though he's returned to your hand, which could, ready Prince Imrahil, he doesn't have to exhaust, he could have attacked or whatever. You don't have to hold him in reserve just on the off chance that a hero dies. That single damage token normally doesn't make much of a difference. Even Bilbo Baggins isn't resurrected and then auto dies from the point of damage that Landroval drops back onto them, but he is very expensive, and I definitely do want to mention that limit once per game is no matter how many copies of Landroval you end up playing, even though he's unique and you can only have 1 out at a time, that limit is once per game per player, basically no matter what. But kind of the biggest thing holding me back here is just like Beorn, he's super expensive, and for as much success as you and I have seen using Gimli plus Citadel Plate, I think it's going to be hard to justify saving those resources for Landroval.
So certainly at this point in the game's life, it's difficult to heal characters outside of lore, or prevent damage even. And so this is insurance against those points of damage you weren't expecting to take or had to take but didn't want to. I think the final advantage of this card, at least where we are in the game's life, is certain scenarios where we only eagles or ranged characters can block or attack certain birds or bats from the encounter deck. And so while it's an expensive way to get there to cost a 5, if you do need to make sure you're getting those eagles or ranged characters out to defend or attack those certain characters, Landroval certainly fits the niche.
Yeah, I can only think of a couple other things to mention. I suppose I'll toss out there that I really like that Landroval works for any hero card controlled by any player. I think it would be rather clever if someone were to use Sneak Attack to drop Landroval into play. Maybe they take an undefended attack, or one of their heroes is just going to get smashed defending against a troll that gets an unexpected shadow card or something along those lines, and that dead hero is, thanks to the Sneak Attack to Landroval, suddenly saved. And really the final thing to mention is that because Landroval is another eagle, the eagles are coming becomes a little bit more worth using. It's still not quite there yet, but one of our dear viewers, someone in the comments, let me know that a very easy way to conceptualize the value of the eagles are coming is, let's say you're using a 50 card deck. You've got, let's say, 3 copies of the Eagles Are Coming. So whenever you go to play a copy of the Eagles Are Coming, there are 49 other cards in your deck. You simply multiply 5, because the Eagles Are Coming lets you look at the top 5 cards of your deck and add any Eagle cards you find to your hand. You just multiply 5 by the number of other eagle cards in your deck divided by the total number of cards in your deck. So let's say at the moment you've got 3 copies Landroval, 3 copies of Winged Guardian, and 2 other copies of the Eagles Are Coming. You multiply 5 by 8 over 49, and you get 0.82, and that's the approximate equivalent card value of each copy of the Eagles Are Coming. So, on average, if you're in that kind of situation, you're still kind of doing yourself a disservice by running the Eagles Are Coming in your deck, because it's not going to be, on average, worth an entire card. It's like 82% of a card, but as we get more and more eagles over time, as that number gradually grows beyond 1, the Eagles Are Coming is maybe going to be worth a card and a half or 2 cards on average, and at that point, it definitely does become worth using. So Landroval is a pretty interesting card. I don't know if it's necessarily 3 copies. It's not nearly as capable a defender as is Winged Guardian, but it's always cool to see new creatures, it's always cool to see unique characters, and it's a tactics ally with a drop of willpower, so pretty cool card. But Matthew, what is next?
The final tactics card of this adventure pack is the 2-cost event To the Eyrie. Response: after an ally is destroyed, exhaust 1 eagle character to move that ally from the discard pile to its owner's hand. So this is kind of like the event version of Landroval for allies, but it's a little expensive. There aren't a whole host of allies that, if they were destroyed, i.e. They have damage tokens equal to their hit points, that I would want to save by paying for a 2-cost event. Faramir, certainly at this point in the game's life, is a really good ally, but in some senses, it's just easier to have 3 copies in your deck and draw another one. 2 tactics resources is quite a lot, particularly if you don't have resource acceleration, and with Horn of Gondor being nerfed, it's even tougher in our limited card pool here. So this is a card that I think is cool in theory. I like the art, but it's not one I've really ever seen used, and it's binder fodder from almost the day it's released.
Yeah, I'd almost have to create like a giant checklist as to why this isn't a very good card. I do enjoy what the developers are going for. Theoretically, an ally is destroyed and an eagle swoops in at the last possible moment and saves them, and then later you can replay the same ally. I think the best possible situation is that this allows you to use those when enters play and or when leaves play style effects, a second second or third time, like returning the topmost detachment from your discard pile to your hand, or maybe even something like Gandalf, where you can deal 4 damage to an enemy. But tactics resources are scarce. If there's anything that I've learned through playing alongside your tactics deck a great many times now, you have to have this card in your hand, you have to have an Eagle character in play, it has to be ready so that you can exhaust it, your ally has to be destroyed as opposed to being discarded, and then it only returns to your hand, which means that you have to pay its cost again. So just being able to play this card seems like an absolute nightmare, and, Winged Guardian, if you can't pay a resource after it defends against an attack, it's discarded, it's not destroyed. And we eventually see an attack-oriented Eagle that's got a really similar ability. And in this very adventure pack, we see an ally that at the end of the phase, you have to discard it from play. And it's the same exact thing with Gandalf. So I could maybe see somebody using like a chump blocker strategy where your thought process is, okay, I'm gonna block with my Snowborn Scout, it's gonna be destroyed, and then I will exhaust my Winged Guardian to bounce my Scout back to hand, and then I'll add another progress token to a location later. But generally, if you've got the resources to pay for To the Eyrie, maybe you should just defend with your Winged Guardian, and at this point in the game, we've only got 2 Eagle allies, so I'm just not a big fan of this card. I mean, it does specify it's after an ally is destroyed and that you're removing it from the discard pile, so you could still trigger effects like Horn of Gondor and Prince Imrahil, even though technically, in like a flavor, lore, theme sense, the character isn't dying per se. This is just probably one of the most garbage cards we've yet seen, and as much as maybe I'd want to use Rivendell Minstrel a second time to fetch a Song of Kings to get the parting gift of some of Matthew's resources, I just cannot at all recommend playing this card. And do be sure to let me know in the comments if you disagree, but I think this is one of the single worst cards in the game.
Well, let's not beat that dead eagle any more than we have to. Up next, our spirit cards. One of the best cards in the game, at least for my opinion. This is the 2-cost ally, Escort from Edoras. A Rohan ally. 2 willpower strength, 0 attack, 0 defense strength, and 1 measly hit point. But while committed to the quest, Escort from Edoras gets a whopping +2 willpower strength. Forced. After resolving a quest to which Escort from Edoras was committed, discard Escort from Edoras from play. I just, kind of like how his name is printed like 4 times on his card. But 4 willpower for the price of 2, sign me up. This is an ally that's been in like almost every spirit deck I think everyone has made forever. Theme be damned, because 4 willpower for 2 resources is fantastic. He leaves play, he readies Prince Imrahil. Back in the day, he triggered Horn of Gondor, toot toot. Doesn't do that anymore because he's not destroyed, but such a great card. It really gives you that push of willpower when you most need it. You do want to hope he doesn't get, destroyed by Necromancer's Reach, I suppose, and similar sort of treacheries, but I really, really, really like this card.
I do think it's very ironic that he's released in the pack A Journey to Rhosgobel, which introduces Exhaustion, which is a treachery that deals 2 points of damage to each exhausted character. So Escort from Edoras is very handily dispatched by that kind of effect, but eventually that Rohan trait sees a fair bit of development, and a lot of that involves quest-focused synergy. But, how often do I mention that I like to pay a number of resources equal to the number of stat points that I care about? 2 for 2 for willpower is great. 4 for 2 is even better. It is a bit of a bummer that he's discarded after questing, but I think in a lot of scenarios there's maybe only 1 or 2 make or break moments when you really need to transition between quest phases, or you really need to explore a location. you really need to be able to surmount location lock. Just like when we recently played through Conflict at the Carrack, you and I experienced a situation where we were mostly in the driver's seat, but there was one moment where 8 threat worth of trolls were suddenly added to the staging area, and if we'd have been unlucky enough to get a copy or two of the location River Lang Flood, which is a 2 threat value location that gets an additional threat for every troll enemy in play, that could have boosted our threat to an unmanageable level. Enemies would have engaged with us before we were prepared to handle them, and we'd have quickly been smashed to pieces. So I think that you definitely want to hold back your escorts until you really need to make use of them, whether that's just keeping them in your hand or keeping them in play and not questing with them. I think some natural combos here are combining them or protecting them with the likes of a Test of Will or Eleanor to make sure that they aren't destroyed. But they're great at what they do, and as I kind of indicated before, once we do start seeing quests where you use allies and heroes for their willpower value, maybe you can benefit from the significant willpower of Escort from Edoras, but because they're not actually questing, you don't actually have to discard them. Really, the only other thing I can think of to mention for Escort from Edoras is that there's no possibility of using an effect like Born Aloft to try to circumvent that forced effect, because the instant that they resolve questing, they are discarded. There's no action window for you to bounce it back to your hand to play another time. But very powerful quester, very cool card, and I definitely look forward to seeing this one in our series.
Yeah, both spirit cards are a win, in my opinion, in this adventure pack. So up next, the 1-cost attachment, Ancient Matham. It's got the trait Matham, and it attaches to a location. Response: after attached location is explored, the first player draws 3 cards. Cheap, 3 cards. You can sort of spread card draw around the table, or in solo play, be reaping the cards. I think it's really good. Of course, you do have to explore a location. If you get things like location lock and you're not making enough progress, that's always a drawback. But this was really a staple card for, I think, a long time in the early life of the game. I don't see it used quite as often anymore, at least in my local play group. Not really sure why that is, because I don't think its power has diminished, but just not used as often. So it's a great card. Again, it's a way for Mitch to play it and give me some card draw, and that's all I care about. Provided we can clear out some locations. But in a 3 or 4 player game, the person who probably needs the card draw is the person that won't be first player for quite a while, and so that can be a little bit wonky. Certainly if the location is immune to player card effects, that's going to create some issues, but all in all, a stellar card that I really like, and if I peer into my Palantir, I would bet we're going to see this card used a lot in the near future.
Yeah, sometimes when it comes to assessing these old cards, Matthew and I have to do a little song and dance routine about how can we possibly justify using some of them. For Ancient Matham, it's kind of the opposite, where it's like, what can I possibly find to criticize about this card?
Yeah.
We just finished Conflict at the Carrack. The Carrack itself is one of those immune to player card effects locations, and even though this wasn't always the case in LOTR LCG, our current version of the FAQ pretty specifically clarifies that immune to player card effects also means no attachments. But in all honesty, you pay 1 resource, you adhere this to pretty much whatever location you want, and then as soon as it's explored, the first player draws 3 cards. So you're investing a card in a resource, but you're gaining a huge profit from doing so. Erebor Hammersmith is not only a great character statistically, but now you've got an attachment that you're really going to want to return to your hand, and then you can play it again, draw even more cards. I'm not sure that I'm convinced Second Breakfast is worth using quite yet, but given how easy locations are to explore, You can use Northern Trackers, Snowborn Scout, Lorien Guide. I mean, pick your location exploring poison, and it's not as if you have to pick the most difficult location to explore to adhere this to. Maybe it's something with one progress token left that you snipe while it's sitting in the staging area. Maybe it's just something that you explore conventionally. So, unless you're so unlucky as to not have any locations come off the top of the encounter deck, there's really I can't think of enough great things to say about Ancient Matham, so this is a staple, and I look forward to using it. Just like Bilbo Baggins, really the only actual complaint I can lodge about it is that it's a little bit sloppy in that sometimes it misses its intended target. So maybe somebody already has 10 or so cards in hand, and they are the lucky one to draw an additional 3, but when it comes down to it, I can scarcely recommend this card enough. It's superb.
Up next are our lore cards. The first of which is another unique ally who costs 4 resources, Haldir of Lorien. This Sylvan ally has 2 willpower, 2 attack, and 2 defense strength, and 3 hit points. And the text box solely reads Ranged and Sentinel. No ability whatsoever. But man, those are some pretty good stats. The biggest drawback that we've mentioned a few times is that lore cards are often quite expensive in the early life of the games, and when we only tend to run 1 lore hero, maybe 2, it's going to take quite a while to get Haldir on the table. But these well-rounded stats are quite nice. Having both Ranged and Sentinel is fantastic, so it's definitely a good ally if you can get him on the table, if, not sort of vanilla and bland.
Yeah, so Haldir is a card that I really like just because I can't find too much to complain about. He's a great quester, he's a totally solid attacker, and he's a pretty spectacular defender. I mean, 2 defense strength and 3 hit points when you're the same sphere as a Burning Brand, and a Burning Brand can be affixed to characters, not just heroes. It's hard to complain about that kind of thing. What I don't like about Haldir, though, is he costs 4, and even though he's doing everything, he can really only do 1 action per round, and he isn't incredible at any one thing. For 1 resource more than Rivendell Minstrel, he's got 2 additional attack, 2 additional defense, 2 additional HP, and those Ranged and Sentinel keywords, but he's not so incredibly proficient at any one role that I really feel justified including maybe more than 1 copy in a deck. And even then, just like you said, we don't run so many lore characters that it's at all likely that I'm going to have the resources to put him into play. And maybe if I do, we're already doing well enough that at that point it doesn't matter. There's a lot of different 2-attack ranged characters out there, like the Silverload Archer for leadership, the Horseback Archer for tactics. Matthew and I never really use those, even though we normally run twice as many heroes for those spheres in the decks that might include those cards, and I generally don't like to rely on allies for blocking repeatedly. It's easier in my mind to use something like Hinnemarth Riversong for 1 resource, or a Snowborn Scout for 1 resource to chump block, as opposed to investing 4 in Haldir, and then maybe a crappy shadow card results in him being destroyed. So I like him in theory, but he's just misguided enough that he doesn't really do it for me. I think maybe the best case use scenario is if you've got a group of friends and you maybe don't decide in advance what kind of quest you're going to be playing against. You don't really know what to expect, what to anticipate. You're going to be in a multiplayer environment, and that's going to be an opportunity for Haldir to really shine, because maybe one turn he's defending, then the next he's attacking, and then when it comes time to really make a significant amount of questing progress, he can do that as well. So he strikes me as like the Paragon support character, but when it comes down to it, I'm just not exactly in favor of a jack-of-all-trades style decks.
Well, it is a cold day in hell when I like a lore card more than you do. I don't know. I like him, and I totally get your argument about Jack of all trades being inefficient, and I almost think that's indisputable. On the flip side, though, sometimes it's nice to have equal stats. Let's say, and this is perhaps an unfair comparison, but if I had to choose between having Haldir on the table or Escort from Aedoros, what if I don't need help with questing? What if I need some attack power or defense power? Then this guy helps out with that, where so many other allies don't do so, at least as well. And so I guess I kind of like the option of choosing how I'm going to use my allies instead of my allies choosing how I'm going to use them. But some of that comes back to deck building, which isn't the focus of our card review videos, but if all of your allies only had willpower, you're very deficient in other places, where an ally like this could be helpful. On the flip side, if all of your allies are well-rounded, then you're not really doing any one thing particularly well. So I think a mix of sort of specialized allies and more well-rounded allies is probably the better way to go. With that said, I think what's going to make Haldir the most prohibitive in the early life of the game is just getting 4 lore resources to afford him. To me, that's a larger problem than his stat line.
And I will say an additional argument in favor of Haldir is so often when I think about these cards, my default perspective is of the individual who plays exclusively 2-player games. So I always have formidable tactics heroes and characters to fall back on when it comes to attacking and defending. But in the comments, it becomes very quickly clear that that's not everyone's playstyle. So if you prioritize playing a wide range of decks, cards like Northern Tracker aren't just amazing because of their questing ability, but also because it's a spirit character with 2 attack power, and Haldir is a lore character with 2 attack power. Maybe you aren't necessarily running Denethor as a dedicated defender, so definitely Haldir opens up a lot of options for players, and if you are running 2 or more lore heroes, then I definitely do recommend including him in a deck. I just get so stuck in the mindset of making these 2 highly synergistic decks that there isn't necessarily space for Haldir, but in the broader environment where you extend things to 3 or 4 player games, or somebody just likes to play solo with a heavy emphasis in lore, Haldir is a pretty kickin' rad character, even if you're not able to make use of his ranged and sentinel abilities. And just like we mentioned for Landroval being an eagle and how that's beneficial in the Journey to Rhosgobel scenario, if he's going to be one of scarcely few characters that can defend against and attack birds and bats, then situationally that makes him all the better. And once we start to break into a little bit of Sylvan synergy, then he just gets stronger and stronger. So very cool character now that I've kind of come to accept him. And as much as I've always loathed equality, there's plenty of room for Haldir in most decks.
Well, that brings us to our final lore card of this adventure pack, the 1-cost event, Infighting. Action: move any number of damage from one enemy to another. This is a card that I don't see played very often, if at all. I have heard of a few sort of corner case examples where this was like super cool and super fun, and it moved some damage from one thing to another, and it was fantastic and glorious. One thing I'll note is most of the enemies you'd probably want to transfer damage to or from are going to be immune to player card effects, and so that's going to make this card fizzle. So, again, as we so often say with a lot of these events that could be really cool, it's do you want to top deck them? I.e., if they're the top card on your deck and you draw it, is this advancing your board state right away, or is it sort of a contingency card, and this falls under contingency, and I tend to be a player who doesn't like the contingency cards, even when I can recognize how cool and fun they might be. I sort of go for the more straightforward power. I know it's consistently always going to be a good draw, as opposed to this might be a good draw. So yes, it bypasses defense strength to move damage tokens from one character, or one enemy to another. That could be fun, it could be cool, it's certainly thematic. But this is going to be a card that's just dead in your hand 9.9 times out of 10, and I just don't build my decks that way.
I unfortunately have to agree with you that when it comes down to it, infighting just seems like too inconsistent and too unreliable a card to bother putting in almost any deck that I personally care to build. I do like that moving damage, just like you mentioned, totally ignores defense, but it's almost never that you're confronted with a situation where you have an enemy that you can deal damage to easily, like it has a really low defense strength value, but it has a nice big pool of hit points to soak up a lot of damage, and then you've got some really high defense enemy that you can shift all of that damage to. And in that way, it would kind of save you a bunch of attack strength because you're able to work around that huge defense value. But it's kind of a liability to keep enemies alive because for you to be able to damage them, normally that's through attacks, and for you to be able to attack enemies, you have to deal with their attacks. It's not often some really high HP enemy has an insignificant attack value. Maybe you could forest snare one enemy that's engaged with you, repeatedly beat it up, and use infighting to shift that damage onto other enemies, but all of that is just so finicky. It requires so much setup and so many different cards, so many resources, that it's just not worth it. And ultimately, it's just so much simpler to go with a more conventional style of deck. I like that you can manipulate damage prior to quest resolution, like let's say staging happens and you've got some sort of nasty enemy sitting in the staging area with a very high threat value. It's possible that you can move damage from an enemy engaged with you onto that enemy, it dies, and then you're questing against a lower threat value. But outside of really specific scenarios, that just doesn't happen that often. We've previously seen the Goblin Sniper, which is an enemy that's difficult to engage with, and if it remains in the staging area at the end of the combat phase, then each player has to deal a point of damage to one of the characters that they control. This might be an opportunity for you to kill that kind of enemy that you normally can't harass, and similarly, we've talked about the Mirkwood Flock and the Black Forest Bats that can't be attacked, save for characters with a ranged keyword, so I think there are very few corner case scenarios where infighting can be pretty tricky and pretty sneaky, but I don't think those are going to happen very often, and because you're moving damage from one enemy to another, you're essentially healing one just to maybe outright kill a different one. So, I mean, outside of saving you some threat, maybe preventing an attack or some sort of nasty ability, I just don't think this is quite strong enough. Thalon, Gondorian Spearman, those kind of effects you could set up to, again, kind of impale an enemy before it gets a chance to resolve an attack, but just taken all together, if it's not already abundantly clear, infighting is just not a card that I can really see myself playing.
Cards like this, I think, really ultimately speak to deck building styles. And again, this isn't a deck building, podcast or show, but I do think deck building is certainly relevant to the cards that we're discussing. So, for example, a lot of players just want to have one deck that they trudge through every adventure with, and they want to win most of the time. And bluntly, that's not how this game works. I think, Mitch, your perspective on the game is the appropriate one, which is each quest is its own unique puzzle that has to be solved. And so as the game goes forward and we get into more and more current cycles, we're going to actually see more cards like Infighting that have very particular niche uses or answers to the puzzles that the encounter deck throws at us, but they're not always universally appropriate. And I think a lot of players, particularly less deck builders who are maybe not as seasoned as others, want decks kind of like mine, which are just more straightforward and consistently powerful. But some of the best deck builders in the game do what I think you do, Mitch, which is analyze the encounter deck. What is my percent chance of seeing this? This is the one card that gives my deck problems. How am I going to try to solve that problem? And so on the Grey Company podcast, we often talk about sideboard cards, which put simply is a card that would be great to sub into your deck while you're subbing something out for the particular needs of a given quest. And I think, as you mentioned so nicely, Mitch, this is one of those cards. So I don't think, if I can speak for you, that either one of us are arguing that this is a bad card, but rather it really is a particular answer to very rare situations in the encounter deck. I think Goblin Sniper is one of the best examples. So, at least, so far with the quest that we've seen. And so, can there be, again, really fun, tricksy, combo-y uses of this card? Yes. But is it a card I would put in my decks consistently, quest after quest after quest? No. It's a sideboard card at best. And so I really do, as I've said countless times, you have to know what the encounter deck is going to throw against you if you want to have a reasonable chance of success. If you're blindly going through quests, never changing your deck because you don't like deck building, that's when you're going to have a tougher time with this game. But having a better understanding of what it's going to throw your way and being able to sub in these kind of cool, niche, typically event cards is really going to be helpful. So again, are you going to see this card in my deck or probably Mitch's deck anytime soon, or even with regularity? No, but might there be a quest someday where infighting is going to be super fun and we're going to want to use it? Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, so by no means am I attempting to call Infighting anything close to an objectively poor card. It's just not something that most scenarios call for, and the individual situations in which it would be pretty useful are relatively few and far between. But certainly there are some of those on occasion, but whether Infighting is the best option to deal with those, or whether Matthew and I can kind of get by on our more staple card effects, I suppose that kind of remains to be seen. But we've got one last card to cover, so Matthew, what is our neutral?
Well, Infighting is certainly no To the Eyrie, which is objectively bad. So, final card is our neutral card, and a card I love a lot, and that is the 5-cost unique ally Radagast. 2 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense strength, and 3 hit points. Radagast is, of course, an Astari, and Radagast collects 1 resource each resource phase. These resources can be used to pay for creature cards played from your hand. Action. Spend X resources from Radagast's pool to heal X wounds on any one creature. Super cool to get another wizard in the game. Not quite as powerful as Gandalf, but I think there's 1 or 2 major advantages. 1 is Radagast sticks around, and 2, Radagast is a quasi-hero in that he collects resources, something Gandalf does not do. The drawback is he's equally expensive. I mean, accumulating the 5 resources to pay for him is going to be expensive, and then only collecting 1, it takes 5 turns rather, to sort of pay for himself. But I don't care. He's super cool, he's fun, he quests well, and he can help us pay for eagles, and I love them. So, is Radagast a powerful card that can plop into any old deck? No, I don't think by really any definition. But if you're going to be playing an eagle deck, he really is a fun addition.
Yeah, so Radagast is a very cool card. He is ever so slightly weaker than Gandalf. I'm not certain that there's ever going to be an I am Radagast and Radagast means me clip being inserted into the progression series videos. But the earlier you can get him out, the better, because it's going to be 1 turn, 1 resource, so eventually he essentially pays for himself, and you can get him into play with resources from any sphere of influence because he's a neutral ally. He's able to do a fair bit of questing, and he's relatively hardy with 3 hit points, but that's kind of where it stops. He's not attacking for much. He's not really a worthwhile defender. And it's just cool that he can help you get creatures into play. Kind of the big bummer, the big obvious bummer, is at the moment, Radagast is kind of at a bit of a dearth for creature targets. He's got Landroval, he's got the Winged Guardian. Eventually we see more eagles, we start to see some horse allies that are also creatures, but for the moment, there's just not that much you can do with Radagast's resource tokens. You can potentially heal creatures, which is also nice. It's kind of expensive if you think of his one resource as like a leadership resource or a tactics resource, because, there's the lore card, Lore of Imladris, where for the cost of a card and 2 resources, it's not heal 2 damage, it's heal all damage. This is you pay X to heal X, and it has to be from a creature, so that's not great. And Winged Guardian, one of our 2 creatures, only has 1 hit point, so it's not as if you can heal that, but it's totally possible you might heal the Sentinel Landroval, or if you have Landroval save a hero's life, again, readying Prince Imrahil, then Radagast kind of lessens the burden to put Landroval back into play. So he's a cool card. Eventually we'll start to see a few different card effects that require you to use Istari characters, and certainly Radagast is much more easy to bear when it comes to exhausting an Istari than is Gandalf. So he's not incredible, but he can help power up a mono tactics deck when it comes to questing, and if you are fond of eagles and creatures and the other beasts of Middle-earth, then when it comes to getting those into play in large volumes, then I guess Radagast is your guy.
Well, I have to disagree. He is incredible. I don't know. I have such a soft spot for this ally, and objectively, I probably shouldn't, because I agree with everything you're saying. But there's just something so satisfying about getting him on the table, having a 4th character collect resources, paying for fun eagle friends. I don't know. I really, really enjoy him. This is also my favorite quest of the first cycle. So I just have a soft spot all the way around. But yeah, he doesn't really have much use outside, as you mentioned, a mono tactics deck. But he does give some willpower when tactics, is sorely lacking it, and can pay for a lot of those eagles. I will say, however, if any character needs a new version, it is Radagast. Some characters, we have 2 or 3 or 4 versions of him. Radagast still only has his Shadows of Mirkwood version. He definitely needs a new ally or hero card, I think, more than almost any character. So I definitely like him a lot. I do think he's fun in the right kind of, creature eagle deck.
Well, Matthew, just to get this straight, you're saying that after 5.5 or so years of Lord of the Rings living card game, paying 5 for a 2 willpower character is no longer going to cut the mustard when it comes to card power?
Well, yes, but it's Radagast, for goodness sake. And because the other Istari are not in the books, he's the only one we're ever going to get, because he's the only one that's mentioned. Saruman we've got, of course, but the other 2, we're never ever going to see. So Astari are limited in Lord of the Rings, and I don't know, I've got a soft spot. Certainly the Astari trait will become more useful a little bit later on. Whether you want to solve that problem with Radagast is a different story, but he is permanent. And compared to the other permanent Astari ally, he has less of a drawback than that one happens to, that we'll get a little bit later. So there are some potential future uses, but again, not going to see a lot of love outside of an Eagle deck.
Well, Matthew, I suppose once again we've come to the end of yet another adventure pack. So, we've seen another expansion from the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle. You said that this is one of your favorite quests, but what are your overall thoughts on our latest collection of player cards?
I think by and large the cards are pretty good. Every sphere gets something that is good. A Haldir, I think, is the best card of the set here. Both spirit cards are fantastic. Landroval is a good, if expensive, card. And then, I think Dunedain Quest is okay, although of the leadership cards, I prefer the hero overall. So, it's not the case that in every adventure pack, everyone actually gets something good, even though if everyone gets something. So, I think it's a solid addition to our game. Nothing super splashy or exciting, but certainly I think some of these cards address the deficiencies in the spheres, whether it's card draw for spirit or a well-rounded attacker or defender for lore, or bringing back things from the dead for tactics. I think each sphere gets something a little bit interesting with super cool Radagast thrown in. But what are your thoughts on this AP?
Well, I have to say I really like these player cards a lot, and in fact they kind of remind me as to why I love the living card game format so much in the first place. I totally agree that every sphere got some interesting new options that they didn't really have access to before, like Haldir is a very combat-capable lore character, something that sphere was kind of lacking. Spirit gets some card draw, they get some really, really strong new questing character. Tactics gets an option for saving characters from the brink of death, and even though I'm not a huge fan of the leadership sphere of influence cards, Parting Gift certainly has its uses with Glowin, and Prince Imrahil really opens up some compelling new options for playstyle and deck building for prospective leadership players. And further, I mentioned enjoying the LCG format so much. Prince Imrahil is a hero that's kind of had a bit of a resurgence in the modern card pool. So at the time that Matthew and I are sitting down to record this video, the latest content was the conclusion of the Dream Chaser cycle of adventure packs after the Grey Havens Deluxe expansion. So all of a sudden, Imrahil is getting some new cards to power him up to heights that he's never seen before, and even if Matthew and I don't use him a lot, in the early days of this new progression series, it's exciting to know that eventually, just like we're now turning our attention to these old cards, in the future, we'll kind of be made to do so again. It's kind of a cycle of you start to think that the old cards aren't good enough, but then all of a sudden you have new reasons to pay attention to them again. So the LCG format is fantastic. A lot of these cards are very cool. I really look forward to using a lot of these in our decks, and I look forward to hearing Matthew just full of delight at the prospect of putting Radagast into a deck and getting him into play. So cool pack. I really look forward to the scenario. So our actual playthrough of A Journey to Rhosgobel is next. But Matthew, unless you've got any final thoughts, why don't you plug your podcast and let's wrap up today's card eval episode.
Well, thanks for listening to our thoughts on these cards, and if you'd like to hear more of my thoughts, along with those of my co-hosts, please check out an in-depth Lord of the Rings LCG podcast, focusing on strategy, deck building, and the metagame. We are the Grey Company Podcast. You can find us on iTunes, Facebook, all over the interweb, so please check us out.
Sounds good. Thank you to you, the listener or viewer, for checking out another episode of the ongoing Lord of the Rings, the card game progression series. Thank you again, Matthew, for joining me for another card evaluation installment. If at any point you want to get in touch with me, I'm the Hive Tyrant on Twitter and Facebook. If you'd like to support, make a small contribution or donation to the progression series, I'm on Patreon as well. But look forward to our Rhosgobel episode next. Hopefully, Matthew and I will not be destroyed by exhaustion and the necromancer's reach, or have our bones picked of flesh by birds and bats. But I look forward to it, so take care, thanks for watching, and as always, be sure to check back in again soon for much more LOTR LCG content to come.